guys, there's not going to be any of that. Right now, there's only a little bit of it. You've seen it dying for so long, but it's going to be really dead. D-E-A-D, dead. Very soon. So hold on to those things. And that's why I love what they're doing with the Classic Arcade Museum, as I mentioned, was on display at PAX East. And I love that they're preserving those games. And thank you all for all of your contributions with that. Look forward to hearing even more stories that you might have about arcades in future Weekly Ringers as well. Now, on to my personal opinion about my favorite arcade experience. I want to mention maybe a few that weren't on the list. Surprisingly, Street Fighter II was on there, but I was very surprised not to see Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat was one of my favorite arcade games, period. Spent a lot of money on Mortal Kombat. I didn't have the systems at home at that point, and so when we would go to these restaurants or some of these arcades that would have Mortal Kombat there, I knew I was never going to get any of the fatalities. I knew I was never going to be able to show up, and if anybody else was there playing the cabinet, I didn't even go over and look at it because I would get my butt kicked. But because people were so good at Mortal Kombat, it was scary. But Mortal Kombat was one of my favorite games. It was just top to bottom great. At the arcade, there wasn't really, it was hardly any kind of censoring, and you could really have a lot of fun. And even though I was terrible at fighting games, I loved playing Mortal Kombat and reading the text as it went by and like pretending that there was actually a story to Mortal Kombat that I gave a crap about. Because after all, it was just about really hitting buttons really fast. So that was there. Some of the old Neo Geo games, those were some of my favorite arcade games. Samurai Showdown being one of them. That was fantastic. Of course, all the classics that you guys mentioned, Donkey Kong, Pac-Man. I played Super Mario Brothers, but not nearly as much. Cruising USA. Played that a lot in the arcades. That game definitely deserves mention. One that you're probably not going to expect to hear is a game that was at the bowling alley where I grew up, and I loved playing it. There were two, actually. I'm sorry. There were three there that I need to mention. One is Spy Hunter. Spy Hunter is a classic game. You should absolutely take a look at it. If you don't know, now I'm not talking about the reboot that they did, I think, in 2006 or 2007, fairly recently. But the old classic Spy Hunter game, it is absolutely an awesome game. They had that there. The second one is a game called POW, which is a beat-em-up set in Vietnam. And it's kind of rough and edgy, and there's knives. And yes, it came out for the NES, and I played it recently, and I just went, why did I ever play this game? It's terrible. But the game that I want to talk about that was at the bowling alley that I always put a quarter into whenever I was there was Double Dragon. And this was before I even figured out the mechanic of the game. So I was very young. I just went in there and just, started pushing the buttons as fast as I could and trying to, just beat people up instead of realizing that there were patterns to how people work and all that kind of stuff. But I loved Double Dragon as an arcade experience and played it all the time. Although I never even got close to beating it until very recently when I played it on an NES, and now that I know that there are patterns, it's a lot easier to win at the game. And maybe the games are just easier than how I remember when I was a kid, but I was horrible at that game, but I played it every single time I went there. But my favorite arcade experience of all time is actually a game that I owned and played on my CDI when I had it back as a child. But the first time I played this game, it was actually put out by a company called American Laser Games, and they had a series of several different games inside the arcade, all of which I'm kind of lumping together into this one arcade experience, and that was the American Laser Games shooter games, specifically Mad Dog McCree. For those of you that aren't familiar, Mad Dog McCree was a full motion video on rails shooter. Really more than on rails. It wasn't even actually a rails game. It was more of just like an Area 51 where you'd have a static picture, and then these people would pop out and you'd have to shoot them with the gun. And it was set in the Old West, obviously, Mad Dog McCree, and it was just so much fun to play that game. The screens were just massive screens. They had you'd have this kind of realistic and hefty. It was a heavy gun, Peacekeeper rifle. You'd have to aim it off screen to reload, and then pull back on, and you'd only get like 6 shots at a time because it was a 6-shooter. And the game was impossibly difficult. It was, over $1, $1.50 to play, which was insane back then. But it was just a unique arcade experience, and that's why I remember it. And the acting is so terrible. For those of you that don't know this game, and it was actually recently launched for Wii, and I have yet to play it, but it was released for Wii fairly recently, because it's not a lot of complexity to the game, guys. But if those of you that don't know it, go on YouTube, look for Mad Dog McCree, and let the hilarity ensue of how absolutely awful the acting is. The acting is so terrible, the lines and the dialogue are so bad that I actually, to this day, circle of friends, myself, even in the middle, they actually work without people knowing what the game is. We use that dialogue all the time, and it just works because it's so horribly awful. It still gets a laugh even if people don't know anything about the game. So there you go. There you have it. My favorite classic arcade experience from the old arcades that none of us go to anymore is the Mad Dog McCree and all other inclusive American laser games from the early 90s. Truly a unique and wonderful experience. Now, moving on to the question for next week's Weekly Ringer. I read an article this week, very short, about retail for video game establishments, and kind of where these retailers sit in terms of sales. And I was actually really surprised by the numbers, because the biggest number that jumped out at me is that GameStop, I'm sure you all know GameStop, the nationwide, and I'm pretty sure they don't have GameStops in Europe, so all the Europeans, I think you have a different derivation in the name, I'm sorry, escapes me right now, but I think it's actually the same company. So for all of our worldwide watchers, you guys feel free to chime in about your respective retailer. But GameStop reported this year that they had about $9.5 billion in sales, and almost $500 million in profit. And that's a tremendous number. So, but that is the reason why I'm so kind of interested in that, is because I just didn't think people really still bought a ton of games at the brick and mortar stores, at the corner stores like the GameStops or the Walmarts or the Best Buys. I think many Best Buys are actually foregoing game sales these days. I'm not sure, but the point is, the question I wanted to ask you is going to be about that. So the Weekly Ringer for next week is this: do you actually still buy brand new games? Not used games, but talk to me just about new games. Do you buy new games at those brick and mortar stores like GameStop? If you do, why? And if you don't, why not? And specifically if you don't, where do you buy it then? Where do you find most of your game sales these days? Maybe some of you don't buy new games, and that's why you like more retro kind of gaming sites like the one you're watching right now, like we are here at Clan of the Grey Wolf. I don't know, but let me know where you get your new games and how you stay in touch and in tune. For those of you that do pay retail, where do you get them? I'm very interested to hear what you all have to say about that. That is the Weekly Ringer for next week. Thanks everybody for watching as always. Thanks so much for your contributions in the comments and your emails. I am the Commodore from the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and there is no reset button.